Welcome to this explainer. Okay, today we're going to unpack one of the most fascinating intellectual clashes in all of human history. We're talking about two absolute titans of Islamic thought, Abu Hamid al-Ghazali and Ibn Rushd. Now, even if you've never heard their names before, I can practically guarantee that their historical debate fundamentally shapes the modern world you're living in right now. It's this incredible story of theology, philosophy, and politics, a massive ideological divergence that's literally still echoing through the halls of modern academia today. So how did two Arab philosophers essentially split the human mind in half? I know, it sounds like a massive exaggeration, right? But honestly, as we're going to see, a single philosophical clash between these two guys created this huge divergence in global thought. We're going to break this complex history down step by step to give you a really detailed explanation of exactly how it laid the groundwork for how the East and the West would approach the fundamental concepts of reason, faith, and science for centuries to come. All right, let's dive into this. Here is our roadmap for this comprehensive breakdown. We'll start with the struggle between reason and revelation, check out their famous literary duel, and explore how politics actually manufactured dominant thought. Then, we'll trace their divided legacy across the East and West, right up to a super interesting modern translation milestone. Okay, Section 1, the struggle between reason and revelation. Let's travel back to the 11th and 12th centuries, a golden era of Islamic scholarship, to meet our two brilliant yet fundamentally different thinkers. We've got a really stark contrast here. First up, there's al-Ghazali, who lived from 1058 to 1111. He was this incredibly influential theologian and a Sufi mystic. What that actually means in practice is that for al-Ghazali, the ultimate truth was found through spiritual intuition and direct divine revelation. An internal, experiential connection to God. Then we have Ibn Rushd. He was born a few years after al-Ghazali died, living from 1126 to 1198. Now, he was a highly respected Maliki judge in Andalusia, so he was very firmly grounded in the practical laws of society, but he was also a philosopher who deeply admired Aristotelian logic. So while al-Ghazali elevated revelation over pure reason, Ibn Rushd dedicated his entire life to harmonizing reason and logic with religious texts. But here is the really crucial thing to wrap our heads around, and I think this brilliantly illustrates the nuance of their debate. They weren't enemies of faith, not at all. They were completely united by a shared, genuine search for absolute truth. Both of them had deep, unquestioned religious devotion. Both of them had a profound respect for logic and the human intellect. Their massive divergence was purely methodological. They literally just disagreed on how to apply reason to divine revelation. Essentially, al-Ghazali made reason a servant to revelation, while Ibn Rushd saw reason as the absolutely essential tool to interpret it. Which brings us to Section 2, Incoherence and its Incoherence. This is the core literary and philosophical battle between them, revolving around two monumental books that changed history. So, the battle lines were drawn in ink. Al-Ghazali drops this scathing critique called The Incoherence of the Philosophers. In it, he systematically tears into earlier Islamic philosophers, especially guys like Ibn Sina and al-Farabi. He argued that they had dangerously overstepped the limits of human reason when trying to deal with the unseen and the divine. Fast forward a few decades, and Ibn Rushd fires back with what is, let's be honest, the ultimate medieval academic clapback, the incoherence of the incoherence. He fiercely defends philosophy, arguing that, hey, far from being a threat to faith, philosophical logic is actually absolutely necessary for a true understanding of religion. Let's actually break down their three big metaphysical beefs, just to get a really detailed view of what they were arguing about. First up, the antiquity of the world. Al-Ghazali argued that if the universe was eternal, it basically removes the need for a creator god. Ibn Rushd countered that no, an eternal universe is just the mechanics of how an eternal God creates. They aren't mutually exclusive. Second, God's knowledge of particulars. Al-Ghazali vigorously defended the absolute, literal oversight of God over every tiny, specific detail of life, like a single leaf falling from a tree. He argued that if God only knows broad universals, well, he isn't all-powerful. Ibn Rushd stepped in and said that using logic to understand God's universal knowledge doesn't diminish his power at all. It just clarifies it, keeping us from reducing God to mere human terms. And finally, bodily resurrection. Al-Ghazali demanded a strict, literal belief in physical resurrection, stating that rejecting it totally destroys the core of religious reward and punishment. Ibn Rushd, on the other hand, believed that logic and philosophy could be used to interpret those scriptural descriptions as metaphors. Metaphors meant to guide the masses without destroying the underlying religious truth. Moving on to Section 3, how did politics manufacture thought? Because, look, a brilliant philosophical argument is one thing, but how do these ideas actually survive the test of time? Intellectual arguments rarely survive without systemic power behind them. Let's look at the East first. The Seljuk Empire was in power, and they desperately needed to secure their own religious legitimacy among the general public. Their solution? Heavily back traditional Orthodox scholars. And Al-Ghazali perfectly fit this mold. The state basically handed his anti-philosophy ideas a massive, incredibly powerful platform. So the takeaway here is that Al-Ghazali's ideas became dominant in the East, not just because of his undeniable genius, but because they were highly politically useful to the ruling empire at the time. Meanwhile, over in the West, in places like Andalusia and Morocco, Ibn Rushd was dealing with a totally different political reality. The authorities there were terrified of populist pushback. They were worried that spreading complex philosophical logic to the masses might cause social unrest or challenge traditional authority. So instead of getting state backing, Ibn Rushd faced intense censorship. He was even temporarily exiled, and his books were burned. This impartial look at the history shows us exactly how politics essentially manufactured which thoughts thrived in which regions. And that political reality leads us directly into Section 4, the divided legacy of the East and the West. This is where we see that massive geographical split in human intellectual heritage that I mentioned at the very beginning. In the Eastern Islamic world, Al-Ghazali basically became the guiding light. The path of natural Aristotelian philosophy, that was largely paused. Instead, the intellectual focus shifted deeply into mysticism, spiritualism, and strict jurisprudence. Al-Ghazali's framework shaped the minds of later Eastern giants, like the theologian Fakhr al-Din al-Razi and the great Sufi master Ibn Arabi. Even centuries later, modern Arab thinkers like Muhammad Abd al-Jabri dedicate their work to analyzing the profound, lasting impact Al-Ghazali had on structuring the Arab mind. But check this out. While philosophy was taking a back seat in the East, Ibn Rushd's ideas went on this absolutely wild migration. Penned in the 12th century under the shadow of censorship, his works refused to die. By the 13th century, they were being frantically translated into Latin in translation hubs like Toledo and Sicily. By the 14th century, Ibn Rushd's logical frameworks were literally being taught in the earliest European universities, in Paris and Oxford. And by the 17th century, he had inspired Western intellectual giants like Thomas Aquinas, Robert Grosseteste, and Baruch Spinoza. The very ideas that were exiled from the Islamic West ended up sparking rationalism, the scientific method, and ultimately the Renaissance in Europe. Crazy, right? Which brings us to our final section, a late arrival to French. We're going to jump from the medieval era right up to the present day to look at a very recent and very fascinating linguistic milestone for Ibn Rushd's masterwork. So, despite Ibn Rushd, or Averroes as he was known in Europe, having this massive early influence on Latin scholars, getting a complete translation of his masterwork into French took an incredibly long time. We're talking over 8 centuries. Early translations just skipped the French vernacular entirely. In 2005, a translator named Marc Joffre released some selected partial texts. But it wasn't until very recently, in 2022, that Algerian academic Tayeb Marian finally completed the massive full translation published by the prestigious Vrin publications. Finally, Francophone readers have complete access to this foundational text. Now, what's really interesting about this is a very specific linguistic choice the translator made. Historically, the Arabic word Tahafut has always been translated into English and French as incoherence. But Marian chose a totally different path. He translated it using the French equivalent of destruction, or in Arabic, al-Taqweed. Why? Because he deliberately wanted to align this 12th century medieval text with modern French philosophical lexicons. He wanted to show that Ibn Rushd wasn't just calling Al-Ghazali incoherent, he was systematically dismantling, literally destroying his arguments piece by piece. And this is just such a cool example of how language bridges centuries of thoughts. We start with Ibn Rushd's medieval concept of Tahafut. Marian translates it as destruction. Instantly, this aligns Ibn Rushd's work with the 20th century German philosopher Martin Heidegger, who famously wrote about the destruction of Western metaphysics. And it goes even further, directly echoing the French philosopher Jacques Derrida's highly influential modern theory of deconstruction. With a single, brilliant translation choice, a 12th century Islamic judge is suddenly brought into direct conversation with the absolute giants of modern European deconstructionism. Which leaves us with this final provocative question. We've seen how the world was essentially split between the spirituality and mysticism of the East, guided by Al-Ghazali, and the strict scientific rationalism of the West, guided by Ibn Rushd. But as modern thinkers continue to explore these texts, we really have to ask, can modern thought finally synthesize the two? Can we actually reunite these two halves of the human mind to be both spiritually fulfilled and rigorously rational at the same time? It's a question that has taken 1,000 years to ask, and honestly, it's entirely up to us to answer it. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep asking questions, and I'll catch you next time.